The new mechanic showed up on a Tuesday morning carrying nothing but a dented toolbox, a travel mug, and enough energy to power the entire garage by himself. I'd been working at Walker Auto Repair for almost 3 years, and I could count on one hand the number of mechanics who actually enjoyed talking before 8 in the morning. Then Kevin walked through the front door. "Morning," he announced like he was greeting an audience instead of 4 exhausted mechanics. "Who's Trevor?" Every head in the garage turned toward me. I looked up from the engine I was working on and raised a grease-covered hand. "That would be me." He smiled immediately, walked over, and held out his hand. "I'm Kevin. Apparently you're the guy who knows where everything is, who's actually patient, and who's least likely to throw a wrench at the new guy." I stared at his hand for a second before shaking it. "Who told you all that?" "The owner. Also the woman at the coffee shop across the street. Also some guy buying windshield wipers. Nice neighborhood. Everyone talks." I blinked. He'd been in town for less than an hour. "You're kidding." "I wish." He laughed, grabbed his toolbox, and kept talking while following me across the garage. "So how long have you worked here? Is the owner actually as grumpy as he looks? Which lift is the annoying one? Does anyone steal lunches from the fridge? Please tell me nobody microwaves fish." I answered maybe 1 out of every 5 questions. Not because I didn't want to, because he never stopped long enough for me to. By lunchtime, Kevin somehow knew everyone's first name, favorite coffee order, and at least one embarrassing story about each of us. Nobody understood how. "You ask a lot of questions," I finally said while we were eating sandwiches behind the shop. "I know. You ever breathe?" "Sometimes." "You don't get tired of talking?" He looked genuinely confused. "Do you get tired of listening?" I paused. "I guess that depends." "There you go." He smiled again. Everything about him seemed effortless. He wasn't loud in an obnoxious way. He wasn't trying to impress anyone. He just genuinely seemed fascinated by people. By the end of the first week, customers were asking for him by name. Not because he was the best mechanic. He wasn't. Not yet. But somehow every customer walked away smiling after spending 5 minutes talking to him. An older man came in for an oil change and left after telling Kevin about the motorcycle he'd owned in 1989. A college student came in with brake problems and somehow ended up discussing horror movies for 15 minutes. A woman picking up her SUV stayed an extra 10 minutes because Kevin wanted to know how she'd started her bakery. He remembered everything. Every name. Every detail. It was honestly a little unsettling. "Mrs. Alvarez," he said one afternoon as a customer walked through the door. She looked surprised. "You remember me? You mentioned your granddaughter had a piano recital last Saturday." Her face lit up. "She did. She won first place." Kevin celebrated like he'd known the family for years. I watched the whole conversation from under a raised pickup truck. "You know that's weird, right?" I said later. "What is?" "You remember everything." "I like people. Most people don't." He shrugged. "I think they do." I laughed. "No. Most people like talking about themselves." "Exactly." He pointed at me like I just proved his point. "They like talking. I like listening." "You do about 80% of the talking." "Only because I ask questions." I opened my mouth to argue, then realized he was technically right. He asked questions. People answered. Then they kept answering. And somehow, before they realized it, they'd told him half their life story. "You're dangerous," I muttered. He grinned. "I've been called worse." The funny thing was that Kevin somehow respected silence too. When I was focused on a difficult repair, he'd stop talking immediately. He'd just work beside me. No pressure. No awkwardness. Then, the second I put the wrench down, "So what's your favorite movie?" I sigh every single time. Then answer. Over the next month, our lunch breaks somehow became routine. Not because I planned them. Kevin simply appeared beside me every day carrying 2 sodas. "I guessed root beer," he'd say. "You guessed right." "I know. You couldn't possibly know. I noticed you bought one from the vending machine 3 weeks ago. You remember that?" "I told you. I remember stuff. It was ridiculous." He remembered the music I liked, that I hated tomatoes, that my older brother lived in another state, that I'd wanted to buy a motorcycle before deciding insurance was too expensive. Meanwhile, I kept forgetting where I'd left my own phone. One Friday afternoon, after we'd spent almost 10 hours replacing a transmission, Kevin leaned back against the workbench. "Can I ask you something?" I laughed. "You've literally never waited for permission before." "Fair." He rubbed the back of his neck. "When was the last time you actually took a vacation?" I frowned. "What? A vacation?" "I heard you. So? I don't know." "You don't know? I've never really thought about it." He stared at me. "Trevor." "What?" That answer made me sad. I rolled my eyes. "You get sad pretty easily." "I care pretty easily." There was something about the way he said it. Simple. Matter of fact. No attempt to make it sound bigger than it was. He just cared. About customers. About coworkers. About complete strangers. It should have been exhausting. Instead, it felt genuine. A week later, we were closing up the shop when the power suddenly went out. The garage dropped into darkness. "Great," I muttered. Kevin laughed. "This is exciting." "No, it's inconvenient. Depends how you look at it. You really find everything interesting, don't you?" "I try." We grabbed flashlights and started checking the breaker panel. While we worked, Kevin kept talking. Not about cars. About growing up in 3 different states because his mom changed jobs every few years. About never staying anywhere long enough to keep childhood friends. About learning that if you wanted people to remember you, the easiest way was to make them feel heard. I guess I got good at conversations because I was always the new guy. I looked over at him. For the first time since we'd met, he wasn't smiling. "I hated eating lunch alone." The words were quiet, almost lost beneath the sound of rain hitting the metal roof. "So I learned to ask questions. And it worked. Usually." He smiled again, softer this time. "People like being noticed." I didn't answer, because I realized something. Kevin didn't talk so much because he liked hearing himself. He talked because silence used to mean loneliness. And somehow, that made every conversation we'd had feel different. The following Monday started like any other. I unlocked the garage at 7:30, grabbed a coffee from the machine that somehow made every cup taste slightly burnt, and started setting up my toolbox. Kevin wasn't there. For exactly 43 seconds. Then the front door swung open. "Morning, Trevor." He walked in carrying 2 paper bags. "I stopped at that bakery Mrs. Alvarez told me about." "You mean the customer from 2 weeks ago?" "Yeah." "You remembered where her bakery was?" "I told you I remember stuff." He handed me one of the bags. "Cinnamon roll." "I didn't ask for one." "I know." I opened the bag anyway. "Thanks. You looked like you needed better coffee." "I haven't even had my first cup." "You looked like you were going to need better coffee." I couldn't argue with that. By 10 o'clock, we were working side by side on an old Jeep that seemed determined to fight us over every single bolt. Kevin had somehow managed to keep talking while lying underneath the vehicle. "So if money wasn't an issue, what would you do?" "Fix cars." "You already do that." "I know. So dream bigger." "I like fixing cars." "You are impossible." "So I've been told." He slid out from under the Jeep and looked at me. "No, seriously. I'm serious. If someone handed you $10 million tomorrow, I'd probably buy a bigger garage." He stared at me for several seconds. "Trevor." "What?" "You're the least complicated person I've ever met." "I'll take that as a compliment." "It is." He smiled before disappearing back under the Jeep. 5 minutes later, he spoke again. "I'd buy an old house." "Why?" "I always wanted one." "Those things are money pits." "I know. I've seen enough of them." "I'd still buy one." "What would you do with it?" "Fix it up." "You know construction?" "No." "So you'd hire people?" "No." I frowned. "You just said you don't know construction." "I'd learn." His answer came so naturally that I almost laughed. "You really think you can learn anything?" "No." He paused. "I just think most people quit too early." There were moments like that with Kevin. He'd spend 20 minutes making terrible jokes, then suddenly say something that stayed in my head for the rest of the day. Around lunch, we got a call about a car that had broken down just outside town. The owner asked if one of us could come take a look before arranging a tow. The boss looked around the garage. Trevor, Kevin, go. Kevin grabbed the keys to the shop truck before I even stood up. This is exciting. It's a broken alternator. You don't know that. I'd bet $20. You always this confident? Only when I'm guessing. The drive took about 25 minutes. Kevin filled 24 of them with conversation. The last minute was spent looking out the window. Pretty out here. It is. You ever just drive for fun? Sometimes. Alone. Usually. He nodded thoughtfully. I think I'd get bored. I figured. I like having someone to talk to. I smiled despite myself. I noticed. The stranded customer turned out to be an elderly man named Frank. Within 3 minutes, Kevin knew that Frank had been married for 48 years, had 2 grandchildren, restored antique clocks as a hobby, and had once driven across the country in a pickup truck that barely survived the trip. I spent those same 3 minutes actually looking at the engine. When I finally closed the hood, I looked over. Frank was laughing so hard he had tears in his eyes. What did he tell you? I asked Kevin on the drive back. I mostly listened. Funny. It sounded like you were talking. I was asking questions. What did you ask? Kevin counted on his fingers. How he met his wife. And that story took 15 minutes. What else? Why he restores clocks. And another 10. I shook my head. You're unbelievable. You know what the best part was? What? He said nobody had asked him those questions in years. Kevin looked out the windshield. I think people carry around stories they're just waiting for someone to ask about. For some reason, that sentence stayed with me. A few days later, I caught myself doing something I'd never done before. A customer mentioned fishing. Normally, I would have nodded and finished writing the invoice. Instead, I heard myself ask, "Where do you usually go?" The man's face lit up. 5 minutes later, he was telling me about a lake 2 hours north where he'd been fishing since he was 12. Kevin watched the entire conversation from across the garage. When the customer left, he walked over with the biggest grin I'd ever seen. You asked a follow-up question. I did. You actually wanted to know. I guess I did. He looked ridiculously pleased. I think you're becoming a people person. Don't push it. I'm serious. I asked one question. You would have never asked that question a month ago. I wanted to disagree. Couldn't. Because he was right. Somehow, without realizing it, I'd started paying more attention to people. Not because I suddenly loved conversation. Because Kevin had shown me how much people appreciated being heard. That afternoon, just before closing, rain started pouring so hard it sounded like someone was dumping buckets of water onto the roof. Power flickered. Everyone decided to wait it out before driving home. The others gathered around the coffee machine. Kevin and I sat on overturned buckets near the open garage door, watching rain bounce off the parking lot. For once, neither of us spoke. Nearly 10 minutes passed. Finally, Kevin smiled. You know. What? You've gotten a lot better at silence. I laughed. I've always been good at silence. No. He shook his head. You used to hide in it. I turned to look at him. And now it feels like you're actually comfortable. I didn't answer, because I wasn't sure how he'd noticed that. He noticed everything. The rain continued falling between us. Neither of us rushed to fill the quiet. And somehow, for the first time since we'd met, Kevin looked just as comfortable with the silence as he did with conversation. A couple of weeks later, Kevin became unofficially famous in the neighborhood. Not because he was the best mechanic. Not because he worked the fastest. Because somehow everyone wanted to stop by and talk to him. Mrs. Alvarez occasionally dropped off fresh pastries for the boys. Even though everyone knew Kevin was the reason. Frank, the guy with the antique clocks, started bringing old photographs every Friday. The owner of the hardware store across the street would wander over during lunch just to argue with Kevin about baseball. It reached the point where our boss finally looked at him one afternoon and said, "Are you fixing cars or running a community center?" Kevin looked up from the engine he'd been rebuilding. "Both." The boss sighed dramatically. "Just don't start charging for therapy." Kevin waited until the boss walked away. "That was a compliment." "I think it was." "I'll take it." He went right back to work. I was beginning to understand something about him. Kevin never tried to be the center of attention. People simply gravitated toward him. Not because he was louder than everyone else. Because when he spoke to you, he made you feel like you were the only person in the room. I had never met anyone like that. One Friday evening we closed early because business had been unusually slow. The others left almost immediately. Kevin stayed behind to organize one of the storage shelves. "You know you can do that Monday." "I know. So why are you doing it now?" He shrugged. "My brain likes finishing things." "I've noticed." He laughed. "You've started saying that a lot." "I have." "I've noticed." "I guess I have." He looked over at me. "You've become more observant." "I've always been observant." "No." He pointed a screwdriver at me. "You noticed cars. And now, you notice people." I rolled my eyes. "I still notice cars." "I didn't say you stopped." He had a point. Again. "You know," he continued, "the first week I worked here, I thought you didn't like me." I looked up immediately. "What?" "You barely talked." "That's just how I am." "I know that now." He smiled. "But back then I thought, wow, Trevor really wishes someone else got hired." I laughed. "I never thought that." "You sure?" "I'm positive." "So you weren't secretly hoping I'd quit?" "No." "Not even a little?" "No." He seemed genuinely relieved. "Huh. You actually worried about that?" "For like 3 days." I stared at him. "You worry about weird things." "I worry about everything." That answer came too quickly, too honestly. I noticed it immediately. "So?" I leaned against the workbench. "What do you worry about?" He kept arranging sockets by size. "Oh, lots of stuff." "Such as?" "My mom." "Okay." "My younger sister." "Makes sense." "Whether customers actually like me or are just being polite." I frowned. "You seriously worry about that?" "Sometimes." "They definitely like you." "I hope so." "You know they do." He shrugged. "I still wonder." Surprised me. From the outside, Kevin looked incredibly confident. Comfortable with anyone. Comfortable anywhere. But apparently that wasn't how he saw himself. "What about you?" he asked. "What do you worry about?" I thought for a moment. "Not much." He immediately shook his head. "I don't believe you." "It's true." "No." He walked over and leaned against the opposite workbench. "Everybody worries." "I guess." I searched for an answer. "My brother." "What about him?" "He works too much." Kevin nodded slowly. "See?" "What?" "You answered immediately." I smiled. "I guess I did." And what?" "That's it." I sighed. "You never stop digging." "Nope." "My dad's health." He nodded. "My future sometimes." "MHM." "And?" I hesitated. "What?" "I don't know." "You do." I looked down at the floor. "I worry that life is going by faster than I notice." The words surprised even me. I'd never actually said them out loud. Kevin didn't answer immediately. Instead, he sat down on an overturned bucket. "You know." He spoke quietly. "I used to think the opposite." "What do you mean?" "I always felt like I was waiting for my life to start." I looked at him. "When I was a kid, I thought it'd start after high school." He smiled faintly. "Then after college." "You went to college?" "For a year." "I didn't know that." "I left." "Why?" "It wasn't for me." He looked toward the open garage door. "Then I thought life would start after I found the right job. And then after moving." He laughed softly. "And eventually I realized." "What?" "I was waiting for some magical moment that doesn't exist." The garage had gone completely quiet. Rain tapped lightly against the windows. "So now," He looked back at me. I just try to notice today. I didn't know what to say. He always had this strange ability to make ordinary conversations feel important. The next Saturday was unusually busy. We barely had time to eat lunch. Around 3 in the afternoon, a young guy drove in with an old sedan that sounded like it was seconds away from falling apart. He looked nervous. Maybe 22. You think it's expensive? He asked before even getting out of the car. Kevin smiled. We'll take a look first. The guy admitted he'd just started his first real job. Money was tight. He was terrified the repair would cost more than he had. Kevin listened without interrupting. I inspected the car. After about 15 minutes, I found the problem. It looks worse than it is. The relief on the customer's face was immediate. Really? Really? Kevin explained everything in plain language. No complicated terms. No pressure. When the customer left, he looked like he'd lost 20 pounds. I watched Kevin wipe his hands on a shop towel. You know. What? Half the reason people trust you has nothing to do with cars. He looked confused. What do you mean? You make people feel safe. He stopped moving. Actually stopped. For several seconds. Then he looked away. No one's ever said that to me before. I figured someone should. He smiled. Not his usual bright smile. Quieter one. The kind that lingered. Thanks, Trevor. Something about hearing my name in that moment felt different, warmer. Neither of us mentioned it. But for the rest of the afternoon, every time I looked up from my work, I caught Kevin smiling to himself. The compliment seemed to stay with Kevin longer than I expected. Over the next few days, I caught him smiling whenever he thought no one was looking. Not the bright, energetic grin he gave customers. Something quieter, almost shy, suited him. I wasn't sure why I noticed. Maybe because I'd started paying attention to him the way he paid attention to everyone else. Wednesday afternoon brought one of those jobs every mechanic secretly hated. An old pickup, electrical issues, the kind of problem that could take 20 minutes or 6 hours. Kevin rolled the toolbox over beside me. I brought snacks. We're diagnosing a truck. I know. He pulled 2 granola bars from his pocket. I prepare for emotional support. I laughed. You're unbelievable. I've accepted that. For the next 3 hours, we traced wires, checked fuses, tested connectors, and argued with a truck that refused to cooperate. Kevin somehow managed to stay cheerful through all of it. Maybe it's haunted. It's not haunted. You checked. I checked everything. So, not haunted? No. He sighed dramatically. I was hoping for haunted. Around hour 4, I finally found the damaged wiring hidden beneath a section of insulation. There. Kevin leaned over my shoulder. Seriously? Yep. He looked at the tiny break in the wire. I hate that it was something that small. I love that it was something that small. He shook his head. You and I are very different people. I've noticed. He laughed so hard he almost dropped the flashlight. See? What? You said it again. I did. You definitely did. That evening we stopped at the diner down the street after work. It wasn't planned. Kevin had simply asked. Hungry? I shrugged. 20 minutes later, we were sitting in a booth with burgers neither of us had intended to eat. Kevin greeted the waitress by name. Of course he did. Evening, Diane. She smiled. Back again. I heard today's pie is better than yesterday's. She laughed. I only told you that once. You did. You actually remembered? You make excellent pie. She rolled her eyes with a smile before walking away. I watched the interaction. You seriously remember everyone's names. They tell you. Most people forget. I don't. How? Kevin thought about it. I guess. He stirred his drink. My mom used to tell me that your name is the first gift somebody gives you. I looked at him. So if they trust you enough to tell you. He shrugged. I should remember it. Simple. Like everything he said. Simple. But somehow it stuck with me. Dinner drifted into conversations about absolutely nothing. Favorite seasons. Bad movies. The weirdest repairs we'd ever done. At one point Kevin looked at me over his coffee. Can I ask you something? You already are. He smiled. You've never dated anyone from the garage, right? The question caught me off guard. No. Never. No. Good idea. Why? He shrugged. Seems messy. I guess. He took another sip of coffee. I've never dated anyone from work either. You've dated much? A few people. He smiled at the mug instead of looking at me. It never really lasted. Why not? He thought for a long moment. I moved too much. That's all. Mostly. He hesitated. I think I always cared a little harder than they did. Something tightened in my chest. It sounded so matter-of-fact. Not bitter. Just accepted. You deserve somebody who matches that. The words came out before I could stop them. Kevin slowly looked up. For a second, he didn't smile. He just looked at me. You think? I know. Silence settled between us. Not awkward. Just full. Diane walked over with the check. You boys solving the world's problems? Kevin laughed softly. Trying. After she left, he folded the receipt in half without saying anything. I wasn't sure why the conversation suddenly felt different, but it did. The following week, Kevin was quieter than usual. Not silent, just thinking. I noticed it almost immediately. You okay? You've asked me 3 questions today. He smiled. Only 3. By this time yesterday, you'd asked 17. You counted. I guessed. He laughed. You're learning. But seriously. I looked at him. You okay? Kevin tightened a bolt before answering. Can I tell you something weird? When have you ever asked permission before? Fair. He wiped his hands on a rag. I got offered a job. I stopped what I was doing. What? He nodded. In Cedar Falls. How far? About 4 hours. When? They called yesterday. Everything suddenly felt strangely quiet. What did you tell them? I told them I'd think about it. I forced myself to nod. That's good. He watched me carefully. Is it? You should think about it. I've been thinking about it. And? He looked around the garage. At the lifts, the toolboxes, the old radio sitting on the shelf. Then back at me. For the first time, he smiled faintly. I don't really want to leave. I didn't know why hearing that made my chest feel lighter. Maybe because, until that moment, I hadn't realized I'd been assuming Kevin would eventually move on. Like he'd always done. Like he'd told me he always had. Sounds like you've got your answer. Maybe. He looked down. I've never stayed anywhere this long before. How long? Almost a year. That's not long. It is for me. I looked at him. Really looked at him. For the first time since we'd met, Kevin didn't seem like the guy who always had something to say. He looked uncertain, like he was waiting for someone else to tell him it was okay to stay. I smiled. I'd miss having someone ask me 40 questions before lunch. His eyes met mine. Yeah, the garage would be too quiet. Kevin laughed. But this time, his smile reached his eyes immediately. And somehow, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't really talking about the garage anymore. The conversation about Cedar Falls should have been the end of it. Kevin had said he'd think about the offer. I told myself that was enough. But for the next week, every time I looked across the garage and saw him laughing with a customer, I caught myself wondering what the place would feel like without him. It was an annoying realization. I'd spent most of my adult life perfectly content working quietly beside whoever happened to be employed that year. People came. People left. That was normal. Kevin wasn't supposed to be different. On Thursday morning, he walked into the garage carrying 2 coffees instead of 1 paper bag. I made an executive decision. Oh, you drink terrible coffee. I've been drinking it for years. Exactly. He handed me a cup from the cafe across the street. I took a sip. Okay. He folded his arms. Better. A little. A little. A lot. I knew it. He looked entirely too pleased with himself. You realize this is becoming expensive. What is? You buying me breakfast. I don't mind. You don't have to. I know. That simple answer lingered in my head much longer than it should have. He knew. He just wanted to. Around lunchtime, our boss announced that the air compressor had finally died. We're going to lose the rest of the afternoon waiting for parts. Kevin looked at me. So, you want to waste time productively? That's a contradiction. I have an idea. 30 minutes later, we were cleaning out the old storage room behind the garage. It hadn't been organized in years. Boxes from previous owners. Old manuals. Broken tools nobody wanted to throw away. Kevin picked up an ancient service manual covered in dust. Think this belongs in a museum? It belongs in the trash. He looked offended. History matters. It's from 1986. Exactly. You weren't even born. Neither were you. I was close. He laughed. I can't believe you're defending old paperwork. I'm defending shelf space. For the next hour, we sorted through everything. Kevin insisted on opening every single box, mostly because he wanted to know the story behind every random object. What is this? A carburetor. No, this. He held up a tiny metal key attached to a faded leather tag. I looked closer. That. I smiled. I haven't seen that in years. What is it? My dad's old toolbox key. You worked with your dad? When I was a teenager. Kevin carefully turned the key over in his hand. You kept it. I forgot it was in here. You should take it. It's just a key. It's your dad's. He handed it back like it was something fragile. I slipped it into my pocket without another word. See? What? Sometimes cleaning isn't about throwing things away. I looked at him. Sometimes it's about finding what mattered. There he went again, turning ordinary moments into something bigger. The compressor finally arrived just before closing. We stayed an extra hour helping install it. By the time we locked up, the sky had already turned orange. Kevin stretched his back dramatically. I am officially exhausted. That's new. I get tired. I've never seen proof. I hide it well. We walked toward the parking lot together. Neither of us seemed in a hurry to leave. Kevin leaned against his truck. Can I ask you something? I laughed. You almost made it 5 minutes. I tried. What is it? If I stayed. He looked almost embarrassed. Would that actually make you happy? The question caught me completely off guard. I looked at him. Really looked at him. He wasn't joking. He genuinely wanted to know. I thought we already talked about this. I know. But that was. He searched for the words. About the garage. And. This isn't. For the first time since we'd met, Kevin looked nervous. The guy who could talk to complete strangers without blinking couldn't seem to look me in the eye. I took a slow breath. Yeah. His head lifted slightly. Yeah. I'd be happy. Because of work? I smiled. No. Silence. Cars drove past on the street behind us. Somewhere nearby a dog barked. Kevin rubbed the back of his neck. I was hoping you'd say that. Neither of us moved. Eventually he laughed quietly. This feels like one of those conversations where we're both pretending not to say something. I think it is. Good. He smiled. I wasn't sure if I imagined it. Imagined what? The way you've been looking at me lately. I felt my ears getting warm. I wasn't imagining that either. Kevin laughed under his breath. I've been trying to figure it out for months. Months? I talk for a living, Trevor. He smiled. But every time I tried to ask you about this, he gestured vaguely between us. I'd lose my nerve. I stared at him. You? I know. He laughed. Shocking. I thought nothing made you nervous. Oh, lots of things do. Like what? He looked directly at me. You. The word landed with surprising softness. Not dramatic. Not overwhelming. Just honest. I found myself smiling before I realized I was doing it. You know. I said quietly. I spent the first month wondering how anyone could possibly talk as much as you. Kevin groaned. I knew it. And now. I stepped a little closer. Now I think I'd notice if you stopped. For once, Kevin didn't have an immediate reply. He just smiled. A slow, genuine smile, the kind I'd only seen a handful of times. I've been wanting to hear you say something like that. So what happens now? He laughed. I honestly have no idea. I don't either. I guess. He looked toward the setting sun before meeting my eyes again. Maybe we start by having dinner. As co-workers? He smiled. I was hoping as two people who have been accidentally flirting for several months. I laughed. We're not very good at subtlety, are we? You are. And you. I've never been subtle a day in my life. I couldn't argue with that. So, I asked. Dinner. Kevin grinned. I know a place. I figured you would. Also, what? I already know your favorite dessert. I shook my head. Of course you do. I pay attention. I've noticed. That made him laugh all the way to his truck. Dinner happened the next evening. Kevin had deliberately refused to tell me where we were going. It's a surprise. It's a restaurant. Yes. So what's the surprise? You'll see. I hate surprises. No, you don't. I really do. You tolerate them. He wasn't wrong. He almost never was. When we pulled into the parking lot, I looked over at him. This place. You've never been? No. I thought so. It wasn't expensive. It wasn't fancy. Just a small family-owned diner about 20 minutes outside town with old photographs covering every wall. The owner looked up the second we walked inside. Kevin. I stared at him. You've got to be kidding me. What? You know people here too? Kevin smiled innocently. I came here once. The owner walked over and shook his hand. Good to see you again. You too, Mike. Then Mike looked at me. You must be Trevor. I slowly turned toward Kevin. What? Kevin suddenly found the menu incredibly interesting. You've been talking about me? A little. Mike laughed. A little? This guy's been telling me about you for months. Kevin covered his face with one hand. I was hoping he wouldn't lead with that. I couldn't stop smiling. For months. Kevin looked up at me with the expression of someone who knew he wasn't talking his way out of this. Yeah. What exactly have you been saying? Good things. Kevin. I might have mentioned that you're the most patient mechanic I've ever met. I raised an eyebrow. And that you pretend not to care about people. I don't pretend. You absolutely do. Mike quietly disappeared toward the kitchen, wisely deciding not to interrupt. Kevin sighed. I also mentioned that you're funnier than you realize. I am not. You are. I barely make jokes. You don't mean to. I laughed. So I'm accidentally funny? Exactly. He leaned forward across the table. And what? I told him you're one of the kindest people I've ever met. I blinked. I'm not. Kevin looked genuinely confused. Trevor. What? You found my dad's toolbox key more important than finishing work. That was different. You stay late every Friday to help the apprentice clean without telling anyone. He's still learning. You fixed Mrs. Alvarez's grandson's brakes for free. He couldn't afford it. You visit Frank once a month just to wind his antique clocks because his arthritis got worse. I stared at him. How do you know all that? He smiled softly. I pay attention. The words landed differently now. I had spent months watching him notice everyone around him. I hadn't realized he'd been noticing me just as closely. I don't tell people that stuff. I know. Then how? I watch. For the first time in years, I felt seen. Not because I'd done anything impressive. Because someone had quietly noticed the things I never talked about. Dinner somehow lasted almost 3 hours. Neither of us noticed. We talked about childhood. About the mistakes we'd made. About the people who shaped us. I learned Kevin called his mom every Sunday without fail. He learned I still rebuilt old engines with my dad whenever I visited. At one point he laughed. You know what's funny? What? I spent months asking you questions. You definitely did. And I kept thinking you were hard to figure out. I am. No. He smiled. You just answer honestly. I don't tell long stories. You don't need to. He rested his chin in his hand. You always tell the truth. I looked at him. I try. I know. Another quiet settled over the table. Comfortable. Easy. Kevin smiled. I like this. So do I. You know. He looked almost amused. I've talked less tonight than I usually do. I noticed. You've been talking more. I guess I have. You know why? I shook my head. Because I wanted to hear what you had to say. Over the next month, very little changed. And somehow, everything changed. We still worked together. Still argued over impossible repairs. Still shared lunch almost every day. The only difference was that now, after work, we didn't always drive home separately. Sometimes we'd grab dinner. Sometimes we'd walk around the small park near the river. Sometimes we'd sit in the empty garage after everyone else left, talking until one of us finally realized how late it had gotten. Nothing felt rushed. Neither of us wanted it to. One evening we were locking up when Kevin suddenly stopped. What? He looked toward the front office. Our first conversation. What about it? You remember what I asked? I laughed immediately. Who's Trevor? He pointed at me. Exactly. You also asked about 20 other questions. I did. You barely let me answer. I was nervous. I looked at him. You were. Of course. You hid it well. I always talk more when I'm nervous. That explained a lot. He smiled. I walked in thinking I'd probably stay here 6 months. And now, he looked around the quiet garage. I think I found home. I didn't answer. Instead, I stepped closer and wrapped him in a hug. Nothing dramatic. Nothing rushed. Just a quiet moment in the middle of an empty garage. After a few seconds, Kevin laughed softly. You know. What? For someone who claims not to be emotional, you talk too much. I know. He smiled against my shoulder. And somehow, his voice was quieter than I'd ever heard it. You always know exactly when words aren't necessary. For once, the most talkative man I'd ever met was perfectly happy with the silence. And somehow, that silence said everything neither of us needed to explain. The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm that felt so natural neither of us questioned it. Kevin stayed. He turned down the offer in Cedar Falls. When I asked whether it had been a difficult decision, he smiled. It was. I waited. Then I realized every reason I wanted to leave was about running toward something. And now, he looked around the garage. Now I'd be running away from something. I understood exactly what he meant. Our co-workers figured it out long before anyone said anything. Not because we were trying to hide it. We just weren't making announcements. One afternoon, while Kevin was helping me reinstall a transmission, our boss wandered past, watched us for a few seconds, then casually said, So, Kevin looked up. So, you two finally done pretending? I nearly dropped the wrench. Kevin blinked. Pretending what? The boss rolled his eyes. Kevin. Yes. You've been bringing Trevor breakfast for months. Kevin nodded slowly. Correct. You remember his favorite dessert. Also correct. You somehow know when he has a headache before he says anything. Kevin thought about it. Also correct. The boss looked at me. And Trevor. Yeah. You smile now. I frowned. I always smiled. No. He shook his head. You smiled when customers said something funny. He pointed toward Kevin. Now you smile before this guy even finishes a sentence. Kevin looked incredibly pleased. I knew it. I sighed. You noticed too? Everyone noticed. The boss patted Kevin on the shoulder. About time. Then he walked away like he'd merely commented on the weather. Kevin looked at me. Well, I thought we were being subtle. We weren't. Apparently not. We both started laughing. A month later, Mrs. Alvarez invited the entire garage to the bakery after closing. It was the anniversary of her business opening. Naturally, Kevin already knew that. Naturally, he'd bought flowers. You buy flowers for everyone? No. Then why? She told me nobody had ever brought flowers to celebrate her bakery. When? About 5 months ago. You remembered that. I told you. He smiled. I remember stuff. The bakery was crowded. Customers, neighbors, families. Frank was there too, proudly showing everyone photographs of the clock he'd recently restored. When he spotted us, he waved us over immediately. There they are. Kevin grinned. Frank. Frank looked at me. You finally convinced him to slow down? I laughed. I've been trying. Frank shook his head. No. He smiled knowingly. I meant Kevin convinced you. I looked toward Kevin. He was already talking to Mrs. Alvarez's granddaughter about college applications, listening more than speaking. As always, Frank noticed me watching him. He does that with everybody. I know. But, Frank smiled. He looks at you differently. I didn't answer, because he was right. A few minutes later, Kevin returned carrying 2 slices of pie. Apple. He handed me one. My favorite. I know. I never told you. You mentioned your grandmother used to make apple pie every Thanksgiving. I laughed. That was months ago. I know. You really don't forget anything. He thought for a moment. I forget lots of things. Like what? He smiled. Mostly the ones that don't matter. Autumn slowly turned into winter. The garage got colder. Business got busier. Kevin still talked more than anyone I'd ever met. But now I understood something I hadn't at the beginning. He wasn't filling silence because he was uncomfortable. He was building connections. One conversation at a time. One remembered name. One remembered story. One remembered favorite dessert. One remembered birthday. He had spent years becoming the kind of person people remembered because he'd been afraid of being forgotten. And somewhere along the way, he'd simply become someone worth remembering. One evening, just before Christmas, we stayed late to finish a repair. Snow drifted quietly outside the open garage door. The shop was almost completely silent. Kevin tightened the last bolt, stood up, stretched, and looked around. You know what? What? This is probably my favorite place. The garage. He nodded. I never thought I'd say that. Because of the cars? He smiled. No. The people? He smiled even wider. Mostly one person. I walked over to shut off the lights. You know. What? The first day you worked here. I talked too much? You definitely talked too much. He laughed. I still do. You do. I switched off the last light. The garage fell into the soft glow coming through the windows from the streetlights outside. When you asked who Trevor was, I looked at him. I thought you were going to drive me completely insane. Kevin burst out laughing. I almost did. You came very close. And now, I smiled. Now I can't imagine this place without hearing your voice. For once, Kevin didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stepped closer, resting his forehead lightly against mine. You know what my favorite conversation has been? What? The one that's still going. Outside, snow continued falling. Inside, the garage was quiet. Months earlier, I would have expected Kevin to fill that silence with another story, another question, another joke. Instead, he simply smiled, because he no longer needed words to know he was exactly where he belonged. And somehow, the most talkative man in the world had taught me that the best conversations aren't measured by how much is said. They're measured by finding someone with whom silence feels just as meaningful. A year later, I realized something. Kevin still asked just as many questions. The difference was that now I usually knew where they were going. We'd settled into a life that felt wonderfully ordinary. We worked together, argued over impossible repairs, shared lunches, took turns bringing coffee in the mornings, though Kevin insisted I still made terrible choices. You bought the cheap coffee again. It tastes fine. It tastes like regret. It tastes like coffee. He took one sip and made an exaggerated face. I rest my case. I laughed. You know, a year ago I would have argued with you. And now, I've accepted your impossible growth. One quiet Tuesday morning, a young mechanic named Liam walked into the garage carrying a brand new toolbox and looking like he'd rather be anywhere else. Kevin nudged me. Remember somebody? I smiled. Yeah. Liam stood awkwardly near the entrance until our boss pointed toward us. Trevor, Kevin, get him started. Kevin walked over immediately. Morning. Liam looked startled. I'm Kevin. The kid introduced himself quietly. Kevin shook his hand. First day. Yeah. Nervous. A little. Kevin smiled. I was too. I nearly laughed out loud. Kevin? Nervous? Liam looked just as surprised as I felt. You were. Oh, absolutely. Kevin pointed toward me. I thought Trevor hated me. I groaned. We're still telling that story? Forever. He looked back at Liam. Turns out he was just quiet. I am quiet. You are. Kevin grinned. But not unfriendly. I watched the conversation unfold from across the garage. Kevin asked about Liam's hometown, what kind of cars he liked, whether he'd worked in a small shop before. Within 10 minutes Liam looked noticeably more relaxed. I leaned against the workbench. You're doing it again. Kevin looked over. What? Collecting another person. He smiled. I remember what it felt like. I knew exactly what he meant. Later that afternoon Liam quietly asked me, does Kevin ever stop talking? I couldn't help laughing. No. Ever. No. The kid sighed dramatically. I don't know how you keep up. I looked across the garage. Kevin was helping an elderly customer understand why her battery needed replacing. He wasn't rushing, wasn't using complicated words, just patiently explaining everything. The customer left smiling. I found myself smiling too. You get used to it. Liam followed my gaze. He seems like a really good guy. He is. The nicest mechanic I've ever met. I nodded. Yeah. He always like that? I thought for a moment. Every day. That evening Kevin and I closed the garage together. Again, some habits never changed. As we locked the front door, he looked up at the sky. You know. What? I was thinking. That's dangerous. I know. He bumped my shoulder lightly. I've been here longer than anywhere else in my life. How does that feel? He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked back at the building. At the lights we'd just turned off. At the sign hanging over the entrance. Peaceful. He smiled. I used to think staying in one place meant I'd stop growing. And I was wrong. We started walking toward the parking lot. I've changed more here than anywhere else. I looked at him. You have. You too. I don't know about that. Kevin laughed. Trevor. What? You ask customers follow-up questions now. I do. You know everybody's birthday. I learned from someone. You actually tell people when you're worried instead of pretending everything's fine. I smiled. I guess I do. He nodded. You've changed. Maybe I had. Not because Kevin wanted me to become someone different. Because he'd reminded me that caring didn't have to be loud. Sometimes it was remembering a favorite pie. Sometimes it was bringing someone better coffee. Sometimes it was asking one more question. Sometimes it was simply noticing. A few weeks later, we were cleaning up after another long day when Frank stopped by. He'd become a regular visitor, even when his car didn't need anything. He leaned on his cane and smiled at both of us. I've been meaning to tell you boys something. Kevin looked up. What's that? Frank chuckled. You know, after my wife passed away. Kevin quietly set his wrench down. I stopped talking much. Neither of us interrupted. I figured people didn't really want to hear old stories. He smiled sadly. Then one day this young mechanic asked me how I'd met my wife. Kevin stayed completely still. I don't think anyone had asked me that in 20 years. The garage was silent. Frank looked at Kevin. You gave me those memories back. Then he looked at me. And you made sure my car was always safe enough to go visit her grave. I felt my throat tighten. Frank smiled. People think mechanics fix cars. He slowly shook his head. Sometimes you boys fix people too. After he left, neither Kevin nor I spoke for several minutes. Finally, Kevin quietly said, I don't think I'll ever forget that. You won't. I hope I helped. You did. He looked down at his hands. I just asked questions. I smiled. Sometimes that's exactly what people need. Years from now, I know people will probably remember Kevin as the mechanic who talked to everyone. The guy who somehow knew every customer's name. The one who never forgot birthdays, favorite desserts, or the stories people told him years earlier. They'll remember the conversations, the laughter, the energy he carried into every room. But that's not what I'll remember first. I'll remember the moment I realized why he talked so much. Not because he needed to hear himself, because he wanted other people to feel heard. And in doing that, he changed an entire little garage. He changed a neighborhood. He changed me. Funny enough, the new mechanic really was the most talkative person in the world. But in the end, the greatest thing he ever taught me wasn't how to talk. It was how to listen.